Any areas you want to touch on? You're like, hey, I thought about this. Anything you want to go back over? No? Yeah.
Seems like part of the problem is that we have like evangelism, and we have discipleship. We really need to do the two need to be connected like the two flip sides of the coin.
Like justification and sanctification.
Yeah, because like you hear about people talking about this one-liner or whatever, or you may just have an encounter with somebody at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And you can't really follow up with them. So you can't go deep, you can't really disciple them, give them what you know is, the Bible says, is information on the good life.
Yeah.
So
you're dropping tracks.
how do you,
You're planting.
and I guess a lot of Christians maybe feel that if they witness, they've done their like you said, checking it off, I've done mine 50 each of the day. Now, of course, that might be one touch, and that person has to be touched so many times before they come to know the Lord down the road. We don't know. All we can do is sow the seed.
Yeah.
But we can disciple them as an opportunity. So how do you, I'm just sitting here while all this is going on, thinking, how do you merge those together to where they're inseparable? You have to have a relationship. I think, personally, and I like to include myself into the crowd so I don't feel guilty, that a lot of Christians might feel that they don't want that relationship. They just want to hear it.
Yeah.
They throw this at you.
Yeah, I don't want to hang out with the soil. I just want to drop my seeds in the soil.
Yeah. That's that. I need to repent of that.
Yeah, and I we were talking at the break, and I think, in a culture where people have sort of a Christian vocabulary, you can do that. We don't live in that world anymore. I mean, here it's still around because people still have Bible verses on their mailbox. But like when I first moved here, when I first moved in the area and people would say to me, so what do you do for a living, and then where do you worship? I was like, why do you assume I worship? Like, I'm from Philly. I just assume you're an atheist until proven otherwise. I mean, like, I don't assume anything, right? So I think when you have sort of Christian culture, you can do that. Where I think if we were part of the underground church in China, that wouldn't work. And there you have to tell them what they're really signing up for. It's not a sales pitch. So, yeah. 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 So I think you're right. I think so that's part of it. Do we just want to kind of toss seeds? And maybe we've had it too good too long where we've lived in a Christian culture and people just had Christian lingo they knew, right? They knew the language. And for instance, when I teach the first Great Awakening, so 1730s, 17, and then the second Great Awakening, 1830s, in some ways, those revivals were not what we're dealing with. You weren't dealing with unchurched people, you weren't dealing with de-churched people. You were dealing with unchurched people. You were dealing with people who may have been to church, grew up, knew Christian language, and you're bringing them back. Now in certain quarters, you might as well be starting off in Soviet Russia. They just don't have the language. Again, I know that's when you're sort of in, we joke about Pennsylvania, right? Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Kentucky in the middle, right? Pennsyltucky. And when you're in the Pennsyltucky section, it's different. But you go out to the coast, you go out to Pittsburgh in the suburbs, Philly in the suburbs. No, you can't assume any of that. You can't assume anybody believes anything. And so I think that's the challenge, right? That's it. I think too, though, so many people are lonely today. It is an opportunity where there's a need. But if we're also in this really... So when I teach at the seminary or at the college, I teach kids about a 19th century philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche had this whole sort of like philosophy. It was like a hermeneutic of squinting. He was always suspicious, right? So you want to be a pastor. What do you really want? What, do you just want to control people? You want to manipulate them? Make them feel bad about themselves? Like he had that, he was always that sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. We're all Nietzsche now. We live in the culture of Nietzsche. Everyone's suspicious. What's he really up to? What's he really want? That Fauci, is he on the take? Right? This guy. Does he really believe what he says he believes? Like what's really going on there? Like that's kind of where we've gotten to in the culture. If that's the case, I'm not sure they're just going to believe our chit-chat. They're going to have to experience us and say, oh no, he's legit. This is legit. They're real. That's how they roll. You know, the girl that was here was homeschooled, right? If I play my Nietzsche suspicion and I'm a secular, I'm going to say, oh, they just don't want their kid exposed to be open-minded. They want to keep them closed-minded, right? That's sort of, it's just automatically a negative, right? Although homeschooling started with hippies on commune, so that can cut both ways. But anyway, so yes, I think you're onto something. And we have to, as we think about evangelism, we have to have discipleship in our mind. And how are we going to plan to do this? And what is this going to look like? I think the other thing too, not only are we just obsessed with business talk, we're obsessed with programs. We can program our way to solve this, right? Who's got a curriculum? Who's going to sell me Jesus curriculum? That I think is the other problem, right? It's we think we can almost kind of buy the problem away, where what it's really going to take is getting down in the trenches and dirty with people who are broken. And you might not have a lot of statistics to report back to the home office. So, you know, in 1950, when Billy Graham's in Yankee Stadium, thousands of people are coming to faith. Imagine having a revival service at a baseball stadium. Even that sounds strange to me now. I mean, it happens a little bit, but not like it used to. It's just crazy. But people knew the language. They knew the language. And plus, that was the most church time America ever was. Everybody went to church in the 50s. Catholics, liberals, Jews, Muslims, everybody. It's when we put in God we trust and our money. Everybody went to church. It was that's where I think some people will hope we could get back to. You had a question.
I was just going to add on to what you said. It was kind of tied into what Tim said earlier. Like, we just want to give them a book or something and say this is this, and not really wanting to see how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like even when we say it, like, well, we're going to give them a book, right? Like it's out there somewhere, right? Like, you know, better we could just hire a plane to drop the tracks over the neighborhood, right? Like some sort of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, just spray the place with tracks and let that. So yeah, I think you're right. What does it mean to actually be in relationship? And I think the bigger piece too is, what does it mean for us to live in the reality of union with Christ versus some sort of, oh, that's outside of me? What does it mean when you hear that Jesus is connected with us, we're united to Christ? What does that actually, when you hear that, what do you think? What do you think of? Does it sound weird? Young people, does that sound weird? Yeah? Like when you hear it, what do you think? What's your first thought? Or have you read it so much in Scripture, it doesn't sound weird, but you're not really sure what it is. What do you think?
Well, when I think about I'm united with Christ, I know He's God. So I have a union with, like you said, with the Godhead through Christ.
Yeah.
But if somebody on the street who doesn't really know
Yeah.
who Jesus Christ, that He's God, they just think He's some great guy who lived in the past, so maybe He's a revolutionary. So if you're united with Him, you're in the revolution. Well, what's the revolution? Jesus revolution? What's that? You know, like.
Yeah.
Like, the way that I think about uniting with Christ, it's almost like, after you're saved and stuff, you begin to, like, think and, like, feel like Christ, you know what I mean? Like, becoming more and more like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's definitely that piece, and I think you can talk like that, but still kind of keep Jesus outside of you, right? Like there's this model to attain to, and I want to be like that, and I want those characteristics, I want that on my resume. But there's something more intimate when you're actually united to that person, right? Like again, I think marriage is such a great picture of that. Right? You're united to this person. That changes the whole trajectory of even why I take out the trash or why I clean the toilet. There's little things like that. It should anyway. I didn't think like that when I first got married, but my wife is a very gracious lady. But yeah, when to actually start to think about a physical connection, a spiritual connection. And I think that's hard for for some of us to think about, that sort of spiritual connection, because we've been catechized by the Enlightenment and we like to think rationally, and we don't have a sort of space for that mystery, that sort of mysticism that's connected to it. Sometimes we don't even like that word. It scares us. But there's something going on. I mean, what does Paul say? Like, God's revealed the mystery of the ages. It's there. So I think it's interesting when you read some of the conversion stories of people from the first Great Awakening. It was very common for people to say, "My mind was enlightened." Like that's a very safe way, right? I'm going to keep Jesus in the upstairs versus to the core of my being, that type of thing. And then I think once you start looking at discipleship as how are we becoming more united to Christ, and understanding, and maybe part of the problem is this: if we're going hiking and we don't have a map and we don't know where we're going, we're just going to roam around in the woods. But when you have a telos, you have an aim. What is that aim? Now you can start to see things through that lens. Right? I'm closer to this. I'm moving in this direction. I'm moving in that space. Versus, I'm not going to go to hell. You know what I mean? It's no longer is it a journey towards something. Rather, it's I bought this insurance so this doesn't happen. That, I think, is a game changer. Because then you start asking yourself, what does it look like to grow in union in my learning? What does it grow to mean growing in my marriage, in my relationships with my neighbors, in relationship with my friends? What does that look like? Yeah. Anyone else? I don't know. Yeah.
Looking back, you talked about Calvin and Edwards, but looking back, is there a time period where you can look at, or a particular segment during a time period where this was being done really well, discipling people into this idea of union with Christ?
Yes. There's two times I think where you see this, where there was just an emphasis on this type of thing. And one is the Puritans. Right? The Puritans thought and talked this way. Jonathan Edwards, John Owen, they talked in this way. They because the Puritans were okay with a little mystery. They were okay with a little mystery. What I liked about the Puritans is they were able to balance the heart with the head. They did it well. Not all of them, but most of them did it well. My sort of running joke is that, most Reformed people rather read a book about the Holy Spirit than experience the Holy Spirit, right? That's not the Puritans. That's not the Puritans. The other are the Pietists, right? The Moravians. Not now, but like back in the day. The Moravians, these German Pietists, where there was a sense of, I have my doctrine, but what does it mean to be holy? What is the connection? The Methodists. The Methodists, right? I mean, what was it? It was the method. There was a process by which we are growing in holiness. And sometimes that gets, with the Methodists, sometimes that can lean into some perfectionism. Eventually, it will lead into holiness, and you're holy because you have certain demonstrable gifts. Okay? So that can happen. Wesley doesn't have a robust doctrine of union with Christ in that way. It's more in that Reform camp that they talk that way. Again, the Puritans are in that, but I think you can actually look at the First Great Awakening, 1730s, and the Second Great Awakening. These are two very different events. Very different. The First Great Awakening, it is people who are not trying to use a method. They're not trying to convince you. It is true pietist type of people, like Whitefield, like Edwards. The Second Great Awakening, it's a very different situation. Not a knock, it's just reality. You have a lot of people traipsing through leading revivals who are not educated. They've been trained a little bit, but they know they've got street smart, or farm smart, I guess, out here. And they kind of know how to talk in those ways and that type of thing, and people will come to faith. Also, too, during that time period, during the 19th century, individualism was on the rise. See, you asked me about heresies. Individualism is an American heresy, right? Because I have my personal relationship with Jesus. I accepted Jesus. I even have the shirt. It's all kind of like what I did, and I'm not just picking on Arminians, right? It's what I've done. And we treat communion that way. We treat baptism that way, right? Versus baptism, whether you're a Dunkard or a sprinkler, whether you're infant baptized or you are believer's baptism, if this is a physical manifestation of becoming in union with Christ, that's got a lot more power to it. If the sacrament's not just, it just reminds me of Jesus, but rather it has more substance to it, it's weightier. Now you've got these pieces here that actually nourish this union, that picture the union. I think that's a different. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anybody else? Did you ever hand up? Did I miss you? Okay.
So back at the very beginning, when you asked what unification means to the younger generation, and you pointed to us young people.
Yeah.
So for me, unification is a union is another name for train station.
Yeah, all the lines connect.
Put it that way, and it kind of like everything of your life, like kind of goes through the train station, like all the trains meet there,
Yeah.
all the trains of life, relationships, career, whatever, it all goes through the Holy Spirit, and then, and also, I don't know if you heard the song called Train Station by Gray Haven. Little kitchen baby. But basically, the song basically tells the crucifixion story. I can play it for you later.
Okay.
But it really good. It basically all the conductors. So in the train station, it already trained. But it one conductor that said your ticket is free, and the other train conductor said, no, we can do that. We can do this to like be free, like meaning those trains to be other religions, other way how to be united with God. But then there's one train conductor said, no, my train is free, and people who are like lost or who oppose the people who went to God. I kind of went off on a tangent. But
Okay, I get it. I got it. The analogy, yeah. I think one of the challenges here too with this idea of union is in the culture, there's very common to hear sort of, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? And this, over Christmas break, my wife and I went out to Arizona and we stayed in Phoenix, but we went up to Sedona. That is a trippy place. You can get your aura read. You can get crystals. You can even get a map of the vortexes that you can experience on the hiking trail. There's witches out hiking. It's a very wealthy area. So what you have are people paying for some sort of, I don't know, pagan spiritual retreat. You can go out there and experience that. And so I do think people are more open to spiritual conversation or spiritual thoughts today than maybe even 40 years ago. But it's a particular type. When Aaron Rodgers is flying to South America to take ayahuasca, to have a spiritual, psychedelic, psychotic experience, that says something. That says something. But it's usually this. This is where I think union is so traumatic. It seems as if the spiritual whatever, I don't even know what they would call it, right? But it's basically something you can kind of plug yourself into, get some mojo, get some energy from that, and then when you're done, you unplug and you go back to whatever. You go back to being the quarterback for the New York Jets or whatever that is. It's not an idea of putting myself under something. I'm still the one with agency, and I'm kind of using these spiritual things and consuming this type of thing for whatever. You know, I don't know, it's sort of, well, I lift weights for my physical body, you know, I take vitamins for my physical body, and I do ayahuasca to clear my mind. And so that is such a different paradigm than this idea of sort of union with Christ, of I don't belong to myself. And I got to admit, I'd be lying to say that's not a hard pill to swallow. Because our ancestors, Adam and Eve, it was about belonging to themselves. It's a family trait. It sounds weird outside of the Christian culture. But I think sometimes maybe we even have a Christianity where we can kind of do that too. Right? I'm not going to go, I'm not crazy. I'm not going full in it. You know, I'm still going to kind of live like everybody else and do like everything else and just leave it at that. So I think that's a challenge. And I think the challenge is going to be for the young folks in here, not the old folks. They are inheriting a very different world. And I'm not just saying because there's drag queen story time and, you know, the world's going to hell. No, I'm not, no, that's not what I'm getting at. It's just a very different world than it was 20 years ago. And it happened like that. It's a very different place. The technology's changed. I mean, iPhone, 2007. 2007. Right? It's just a very different place. The way we get information, the way people interact. I mean, they're only going to find this out in a history book, right? The West is changing. It's becoming less and less Christian. It's moving away from that. And to really have certain basic Christian beliefs is going to be an outlier if things continue down the line. If a revival happens, maybe things are different. But if it's a revival that just wants to, let's make America like the 50s again, that's not going to do it. We need actual, genuine heart changes of people who want to live different. And I'm not sure, really, in America, particularly if you lived in an area like this, if when you were accepting Christ as your Savior, was there really much of a death warrant in your life living in central PA? There certainly is in a place like Philly. There's certainly a place. So that union, it has cost. It's going to totally shift your priorities and your emphases. And it's going to be harder and harder for the younger folks. But that sort of halfway Christianity isn't going to work either, because the culture's not there to support you in the same way. My mother, she's 75, and she watches the news, and that always creates for interesting conversation. And she's 75, she saw the church boom in the 50s and just thinks the world's gone to hell. And I said, Mom, things have changed. I said, when I was in kindergarten in the late 70s, if I said to my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Weinstein, I think I feel like a girl today. Mrs. Weinstein would have more than likely said, no, honey, you're a boy, Just go over there and play with the trucks. Something like that. Now? Well, who do you want to be? Right? So what I'm getting at is the culture's not buttressing, it's not supporting the Christian ideas in the same way. So to be united with Christ is going to have a very different feel. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are going to throw you to lions, right? Yeah, and sometimes I think American Christians almost like look for persecution. They're looking under the rocks. You know what I mean? Like, oh, are we persecuted? Like, talk to our brothers and sisters in China. Well, you've got persecution. Or Russia. So that's what I mean. It might not even be persecution. It's just going to be, you don't kind of click the same way. You just don't kind of feel comfortable in the same way. You don't feel comfortable in the public library the way you used to, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, is it more that perhaps it's going to look more like a social weirdness than it would be a sort of direct persecution?
Yeah. I mean, it could go back to the early church where they were like, well, they're all incestuous. They call each other brother and sister, and they're cannibals because they're eating Jesus, and it could be that kind of thing. Like it's just weird. The other thing that's going to really changing is that where the church is growing is the majority world. Africa, South America, Asia. They operate with a very different worldview than the West. This idea of union with Christ, I don't think is going to be as hard a sell for them. I think the union for Christ stuff is difficult for us simply because, especially those of us that are 40s, 50s, that kind of grew up when the Enlightenment was teaching us what to think in high school. It seems too plastic. So I think that's, yeah.
Kind of a bit of a shift, but back to what we were talking about earlier. I think it's hard for us as believers in evangelism in particular, because we don't understand ourselves what our sanctification union of Christ is.
Very point, Josiah.
I feel like if we can begin to understand that and enjoy that and grow in fondness of that relationship in our growing Christian walk, it's easy to invite people into something you love and cherish.
Yeah.
I love to invite people to play board games with me.
Yeah.
Because I can usually beat them the first couple times.
That sounds like an idol issue we should talk about.
Well, we talk about that later. But when you enjoy and start to see how your relationship with Christ affects And that union affects you and helps you now.
Yeah.
It's easy to say, like the psalmist, come, magnify the Lord with me.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's hard, is we don't, perhaps we struggle to understand that union and how it truly helps us. Because we're not truly enjoying it because we're distracted by so many other things, the catalogs that come in the mail.
Yeah, the catalogs come in the mail, and also, I think, how many of our churches are really catechizing us to think that way? Right? I think that's, there's a book I read for this. The professor is from Moody in Chicago, and grew up in the church, and wrote a book called One with Christ. And I heard the interview on a podcast. He was interviewed about the book, and he was like, what was crazy is he said, when I actually started to go back and read Luther and Calvin on this concept, I was like, where's this been? He said, no, I've heard it. I've read the verses. I've heard plenty of sermons on Ephesians. But it was like a sentiment. It was like a notion. It's not my oxygen. And I think that's it. I mean, that's so much that, what does it mean to be Jesus people? We are the people who are united to Christ. We're united to the man, the God-man.
And to add to that bread, that we need this, like, I think about it in relation to our own sin. And how many times we've been taught, don't do this because of X, Y, and Z. But how about, don't do this because I'm not my own.
Yeah.
I'm his. I'm in his team now. Like, instead of a whole host of other reasons to give, which aren't hitting that crux of the union. Like, it's not just that, you should go to the prostitute, to use your analogy earlier, for physical reasons, it's because you're not a part of her.
Yeah.
That's not who you are. You've been bought, you're changed, you're different, you're of Christ's world. Like, to me, that brings so much more depth to our own fight in ourselves and the sanctification process.
Yep.
There's so much more there than just don't do it because of that.
And even we move this, say, into the culture wars. You're saying, I can't do this. I can't do this because I can't do this and glorify God. Right? It's not just, I can't believe you have this here. I can't believe this is in the library. I can't believe that. No, I can't do this and glorify God. Let the chips fall where they may. I mean, that's a very different approach to this. And so you're right, that idea that it affects all these aspects. And I think the other thing, too, that's really important to get at is oftentimes we talk about salvation as this. Well, Jesus died for my sin. He paid my penalty. God's wrath was upon me, and Jesus paid it. We use this very legal transaction language. And there's a truth to that. But that's not the whole truth. That fits under the umbrella of union with Christ. That's part of how God was bringing you in. But when you kind of just focus on that one aspect, it makes it sound like God's just angry up there. And thank God Jesus paid the bill. And so you sometimes what we do is we emphasize a particular aspect of our salvation, but we miss the big whole. This picture is beautiful. It's rich. It's pregnant with meaning. But we just kind of flatten out the gospel, or we just focus on this one aspect. And then I see this a lot when I ask students, well, what is salvation? Explain it to me. And I get the hell, the heaven, justification. I get all that. And yes, that's important. That's Luther. But Luther's also our union with Christ guy, as is Calvin, right? So you can kind of emphasize certain aspects and miss. And I think that's a really important piece to get at, that salvation's it's a holistic thing. It's not just one little thing. It's not just I don't go to hell. It's not just Jesus died for my sin. That's part of it. Now keep going. I used to have a professor at seminary who used to say, I hate when you give me cheap answers. I want rich, full descriptions. Right? And I think that's what Christians need. You need a rich, full description of what God did for us.
Well, I was just thinking with what you're saying right there, part of our battle is that we will never get to the end of that fullness. That the gospel continues to have aspects that we will learn, not just throughout our life here, but throughout all eternity.
Yeah,
that the implications of the gospel go beyond what is even possible for us to even learn.
Yeah.
And again, I think to go back, I think what Tim said was so important earlier, that language we use, right? What's pragmatic to sort of seal the deal? And you kind of just go with those pieces that, probably make it a little more scary versus this richer, fuller thing. And again, some people, they're going to continue to find their richness and fullness and their good life in what they do in the here and now. And there's nothing you can do about that. But to kind of emphasize that, I think has such power. I've even written an article for LBC. Lancaster Bible College has this statement, our mission is to educate Christian students to live a biblical worldview. And you sort of exegete that, and you start throwing in things like God's telos for creation and union with Christ, and what it means to have a biblical worldview is more than just I have a certain way of looking at the world. I'm a completely different type of person. Because I think worldview can sometimes just be sort of mental assent. Well, I believe in certain things rather than I am certain things. Right? I embody certain things. So that's where I like the worldview, but I think it can have almost a mental kind of thing, like, well, I have a Christian worldview, so I'm opposed to that. Yeah, okay. Let's go a little deeper. Let's get into God's telos for creation. Let's get into these other aspects. Anything else?
I wanted to say, about the Puritans, I've heard it said that they were definitely sleep. So there was like such an urgency of dying, with disease, whatever, is the urgency to the Lord.
Yeah, I mean, the average person in the 17th century probably walked around with a low-grade fever because the water was bad. I mean, COVID, compared to some of these, back to the Black Death and some of those, I mean, not to belittle what happened, but I mean, that was the reality of the world they lived in. Life was very uncertain. There's no minute clinic and there's no urgent care. So you're right, there is that sort of piece. And the other piece is the Puritans in many ways were a break-off group. They were looking at the Church of England and saying, that's not holy. How do we do holy? Now, reality, within 2 to 3 generations, that dies out. That's why you have to have the First Great Awakening. People are praying for revival. It usually only lasts a couple generations, and then you're back to a different space. Sorry. It's just reality. But yes, I mean, there was an emphasis on how do I know that I'm holy? They would journal. They had sort of all sorts of spiritual disciplines, and they really tried to think about what does it mean to lean into this union with Christ and live that out. So they're a great model of sort of looking at what does that look like on the ground? What does that look like in my marriage? What does that look like in my profession? What does that look like in this? And again, don't think they got it all right. I mean, some of them are slave owners. So that would be uncomfortable to believe, but it's true. So we wouldn't do that. So it doesn't mean you're still not sometimes a product of your time. and your social imagination's being shaped by the culture more than Scripture. But yes, I think the Puritans are a good way to do this. Where for me this has been really helpful is it's gotten me out of that idea of I think what it's done is sort of revolutionized my understanding of sanctification. Even to the point in my prayer life when I'm praying, God, grow us in our union. Grow us in our union, when I'm praying for my wife and I. With each other, but with you. I think too, when you go so far as to say that Jesus is uniting us to the Godhead, this really can get under your skin when you start to look at some of the things Christians have done to each other. So we'll go to the slavery thing and you look at that racism, right? And you look at this in the church and you think, are you kidding me? Christ is uniting us to God and he's uniting the church, but you're still going to make part of the church sit in a different section? Are you kidding me? That's chutzpah or just depravity, right? So you start to look at this. So what does it mean shouldn't we look unified? What's keeping us separated if Christ is praying to the Father that we're united? But we're trying to self-segregate ourselves in whatever way. And I'm not talking doctrinally even. I'm just saying in social cultural ways, that's just downright blasphemous. That's just downright blasphemous. There's no quarter for that. We can't give any quarter for that kind of thinking. The stakes have been raised. It's not just we want to look better in front of the culture and look like this thing. There's actually something happening. God is restoring the creation. He's restoring us. And when I go to Revelation, guess what? Languages and ethnic groups still exist. Right? So you start to think of it that way, right? You start to think, what does it look like to be the church? If the telos is union with the Godhead in the Trinity, in that intimacy, and you start asking yourself, the way we sort ourselves out, is this a biblical sorting or is this a humanly constructed sorting? So I think that's a helpful way of sometimes allowing our social imagination to be constructed by Scripture versus the culture. What is the end here? What is the aim here? Where are we going? And in some cases, it means being uncomfortable. I think that's the important part. We can't sell salvation like prosperity gospel. Oh, if you say this prayer, let me tell you, your portfolio is going to grow this week. That's not. Because even that idea, it's like, you're just marrying God for his money. Right? That's the other side of this. So it has an effect in not just our personal life, but what does it mean for us to be corporately united? How we are growing together. But then also how the church is the church in any given space. Imagine being an underground church in India. Guess what? You can't play the caste system game. I really believe that one of the reasons the church grew when it did was this very idea. Union with Christ, and you're taking people in the culture who were nothing. They were nothing. The church was filled with peasants, slaves, women. Sorry, ladies, but you were nothing in the Roman Empire. You were nothing. According to Aristotle, you were just deformed men. A feminist he was not. If you were a slave, natural. Just the way, the order of things. But for the gospel, the power of the gospel in that space was, you're a child of the King. You're adopted into this family. You're somebody. They whip you? Let me show you what they did to the Son of God. You can jive with that. And so that idea that I'm coming into this and I'm becoming something the culture won't let me be. They won't let me be human. But in this space, I'm not just human, I'm a child of the King. I'm being conformed into what it actually means to be human. That's where it's so countercultural. That's another question you could ask someone. What is the point of salvation? Why did God create? And what does it really mean to be human? That's the very debate we're having in our culture right now. That's why it's so polarized. The stakes are higher. The days of the Reagan years, that was easy. We just debated economics, right? Now it's humanity. So this is, this really does, it really has helped me sort of rethink how I sort of understand something. I'm actually working on a book right now with a guy on the history of slavery, and both of us are sort of processing this idea of union with Christ. It really does raise the level of disdain when you start to see this type of thing. So, and again, I think too, the other thing it spills into is it should give us a more robust understanding of what it means to be in the image of God. God is restoring this. He's restoring the Imagio Dei in us. He's restoring the union in us. We're not as we are to be. There's a great book on sin, and it's not how it ought to be, right? That sort of piece. Anything else anyone want to dig into?
Studying this morning on Hebrews where it says that Jesus is the exact imprint of the nature of God, the radiance of his glory.
Yeah.
And so I got a little app on my phone where I go back to the original Greek and study words. And the Greek word for radiance has the idea of like trying to hold your hand over a bright light and it's just sort of seeping out of your fingers. But glory, I want to read it here. It's Crossword Study Bible. It says, the true glory of man, on the other hand, is the ideal condition in which God created man. And so
yes,
to glorify God means to be restored in your original relationship with God.
That's true humanity, right? And especially to the young folks. It's easy to talk about this stuff in here. This is easy. This is the easy part. The hard part is trying to figure out how to live it out. That's the hard part. Especially when you're 15. Especially when you're 13. That's real hard. Yeah, you're about 40, you should have it together by then, right? But seriously, it's hard. This is easy to sit here and talk about it. But to actually start to live it out in this sort of countercultural way, depending on where God has you, it's a hard thing to do. It's much easier to kind of do that sort of evangelism you're talking about and kind of have a sort of a fire insurance Christianity and how much can I get away with without getting God upset? You know, that's a much easier, because then you can kind of keep score, right? And people do. But this is hard. And I wish when I was a kid in youth camps and stuff, people would have said that. This is going to be hard. Really hard. Christianity is hard. Jesus says, carry my burden, it is light. Yeah. It's still heavy compared to the burden that the world will put on you. That doesn't mean he also asks you to carry your cross. So let's make sure we're doing biblical theology there and getting the whole thing. It's hard. It's hard to do this and to think through this and to negotiate. How am I going to live as a Christian in this situation? It's difficult. So take that with you as you go on and say, man, this guy's talking about this, but this is hard. Well, he told you. It's hard. It's hard. It's not easy, especially when you're a kid. Anybody else?
So I feel like there's a huge talk about a lot, and so I'm just like, as you're talking to the young people, or like myself, thinking, how, like, where do I start? Where do I start? Football,
Yeah.
and like rearranging the thought process behind how you evangelize and go back.
Well, I'm going to go one step further. Before you reevaluate evangelism, you got to reevaluate what you think it means to be a Christian. You can't give me COVID unless you got it. So if you don't have it, if you're not operating that way, you can't, right? See, I can sell you something and not have it. The car dealer doesn't own the Mercedes. But this, is that what you believe? See, we want to skip a step. We want to get right to the converting. No. Because you might have been converted on the same idea. Or you might have some of those same thoughts kind of roaming around. What for me this has been, I had to rethink my own what it means to be a Jesus person and what that looks like, and because at that point I don't need a script. I can go rogue. Right? See, if you don't exude it, you don't know it inside out, you need the script. Oh, question 3. Do you know where you will go if you died tonight? Right? No. You don't need that when it's in you. When it's how you're already kind of catechized. You can be, you're playing an instrument? What do you play? Yeah. To play the piano, if you're going to like improvise, the first thing you got to do is have the mechanics and the fundamentals down. You can't improvise with the jazz musician until you've got this down, because you won't even know where to go. There's a freedom you get with a muscle memory and doing that process, because then you have the option to do this. So as we're doing evangelism, it's got to come from who we are. Not, I don't want this person to go to hell. As awful as that is. I want this person to know what it truly means to be human. What it truly means for the good life. That's what you're presenting, not selling.
So if I feel like past fall, my church was a curriculum on evangelizing, and I feel like a lot of discussion, but some of the discussion was like just being afraid to evangelize. Mm-hmm. But from what you're saying, if like in that scenario, going back to the root, you would like that would take away the fear because it's not even.
It could. It could, right? You could still be afraid to talk to people. Yeah. But imagine you're talking to somebody about gender issues, because that's a hot topic young people have to deal with. It's a much different approach to say, well, if you do those things, you're going to go to hell. Right? To, well, for me, how I understand what it means to be human. I'm not judging you, right? I'm not standing sort of in judgment of you. I'm telling you, this is the narrative I understand. This is what it means to be the good life. This is what it means. Because remember, the person who thinks gender fluidity is the way to go, there's a summum bonum baked into that. There's a good life baked in. There's what it means to be human is baked into that. Right? So it's not just I oppose this activity. What does it actually mean to be human? And what you would say is, for the human, it means to be in union with Christ and what we're made for, and then you kind of have this place to sort of unpack this. But if you don't actually believe that, and you're just like, well, I don't have sex before marriage because I don't want to go to hell. well, then you're not going to get anywhere. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. So we actually, we need a theology of some of these things. Why do we do certain things the way we do them? Not just because there's a set of rules and it's this is how the relationship works. This is how you grow in the relationship with God. This is what I believe it means to be human. I think that's a completely different approach than some of the other attempts. Does that make sense? Yeah. And not that, everything you learned in your curriculum, no, there's valuable in there, but there's a sense of if you don't actually have it, it's going to be really hard. I mean, you think of the apostles. They had it, right? Yeah. They died for it, right? The missionaries who, went overseas with their caskets. Like, they had it. They knew it. They got it. And this is where the church has to train their people and catechize our people and help them so that when they do encounter, they can actually have that. But that's going to take time to really seep on that. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think that's the good life, like you're talking about, is a really important thing to speak about in our missionary evangelism attempts, efforts, because from the outside, Christians are often looked at as people who are giving all these things up because of their faith, and that's why they're so grumpy all the time.
Yeah, right. They're always angry because they're afraid somebody might be having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to speak of the good life really hits on that notion, that perception from the outside of we're doing this because we are blessed through it. We're gaining something through being united with Christ that other people are missing out on. And it's not a giving something up, it's a gaining because you can't outgive God.
Yeah. I think what this tends to do is it pushes these issues more into the center of our beings versus, well, this is what I'm up to for when I go to heaven. It's more this idea of who I'm becoming. And again, at some point, I've met people and they'll say, well, I think you should, I believe in da-da-da-da-da-da. You list it. And I'm like, at the end of the day, I'm going to have to say, listen, man, I'll keep drinking coffee with you, but we have very different understandings of what the point of life is. We have very different understanding of where we're heading. And when you're there, those are ultimate questions. Those are ultimate beliefs. Those are faith beliefs that people have. And only the Holy Spirit can move those. And no amount of sort of intellectual gymnastics is going to move somebody off of that. But it really, I think it does, it puts it at the core of who we are versus this is what I stand for. Anybody else? These are good questions, yeah.
I was listening to a podcast about a year ago. They were talking about, I don't know if it was millennials or Gen Z, but the young people in our country it used to be like where if you didn't want to pursue Christianity, you just pursued some other interest, some other spirituality. They're pretty much saying like now it's just complete apathy. They just don't even care. And that's scary. But so it seems to me like what we've been talking about, these people are going to be lonely.
Yeah.
They're not getting married. They're getting a fulfillment from their friends. And they're just going to be they're getting dogs. So like when they get older, they're not going to have any family because they don't have kids. I mean, it's a serious sociological problem as well as spiritual problem. But like, to me,
They definitely don't have any social security.
it sounds like they need meaning in their life and they need relationship.
Yeah.
And we need to demonstrate that like on a practical level in the church as we work out our relationship with God,
Yeah.
our union with Christ.
Yeah.
And it's again, it's not just a scheme. It's are we that? You know what I mean? Are we actually those things? Are we actually living out those things? Are we actually believe those things? Yeah, I mean, again, I think anytime you do evangelism, you have to be a part-time cultural anthropologist. You got to read the culture you're dealing with and understand what their questions are and what they're wrestling with, and not just pretend it was the way when you were a kid. The other thing is, as much as it's easy to sit in here and say, well, the world's doing this or the world's doing that, as if, you know, the sinners are at the zoo and we're viewing them behind a cage, we live amongst. Sometimes we're even absorbing some of those things. Right? That's part of the issue of having your zip code in the city of man. So sometimes we're actually absorbing those things, and we need to look at that, because if we're kind of just playing into the same game, it's going to be harder to convince. And so what it means to be salt and light could look different in different cultures. That idea. So I think the sort of the breakthrough moment here is, and it was this young lady's question here, before we move to evangelism and discipleship, we really have to understand what do we believe it means to be a Christian? And what does that look like in how we live, what we believe about Christ, what we believe about God, what we believe about where we're heading toward. And this is the thing. Young people, it's hard to get this. When you're 40, you'll get this. You start to realize, as a Christian, this is not home. This is not home. When you're young, it feels like home, because everything's in front of you. And usually, to get to your point, usually the 20-somethings are the most idealistic. These guys, they're like the old Muppets up in the balcony. I mean, they're just pessimistic because of what they're experiencing. So I think that's another way to kind of look at this, that know where people are and realize that maybe even the way you evangelize to them has to be influenced by understanding that. But again, if we still have this sort of latent, you want to go to heaven, right? View of Christianity, rather than what does it truly mean to be human, I think that will come across. That will come across. Yeah. Are we at our time?
We are.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.